Welcome to our In Focus discussion tonight on civil rights and John Lewis's legacy. Saturday marked 1 year since the civil rights icon passed away from pancreatic cancer at the age of 80. Communities across the country, including right here in Salt Lake City, held candlelight vigils in his honor and to rally for congressional lawmakers to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. Lewis fought tirelessly by marching in the streets and fighting in Congress for equal voting rights throughout his life. Tonight, we remember his legacy and discuss the work that still needs to be done. Joining our live panel discussion tonight are Darlene McDonald. She is an author and social activist. We also have Jeanetta Williams, who is the president of the NAACP Salt Lake Branch, and Betty Sawyer, president of the Ogden NAACP. Thank you all so much for being here tonight. Betty, I would like to start this conversation with you. Let's talk about the legacy of John Lewis. How do you remember him, and how does he inspire the work that you continue to do today?
Rosie, John Lewis is one of those icons that I grew up on. As a daughter of an NAACP peer and a child of the 60s, we grew up watching John Lewis, listening to him, learning about SNCC and all the work that he was doing with the Nonviolent Coordinating Council. And of course, the Voting Rights Act and other civil rights legislation. And we inspired and tried to live out that legacy our own selves and our work in our local communities. I was born and raised on the Eastern Shore of Maryland, and our school system was one of the last schools to integrate. And so we were taking our marching orders from Dr. King and John Lewis, Andrew Young, Julian Bond. These are people and names that we knew and heard about and aspired to walk in their footsteps.
Thank you for that. Darlene, let's hear from you. How did John Lewis inspire you?
One of the things that comes to my mind is that I stand on the shoulders of giants, and that is from John Lewis to Miss Jeanetta Williams, as well as to Miss Betty Sawyer. When I think of John Lewis, I really think about him in his youth. And I think about him when he was 23 years old, being one of the youngest keynote speakers for the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. And when I think about what I was doing when I was 23 years old and how unenlightened I was at 23, but what he did at the age of 23 and then went on to do when he was 25 for the march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, he did that not just for himself, but for all of us. And when I think about one of the most sacred acts that we can do as citizens of this country is to vote. And the protection of the right to vote, the very thing that he fought for and was beaten for and died trying to protect as well, that I know that I can continue the legacy of his work, as well as many, many, many others that have come before me and those who will come after me as well.
Thank you for sharing that. Jeanetta, can we hear from you?
Well, thank you so much, and thank you, Darlene, for those very kind words, as well as Betty Sawyer. For me, thinking about the late Congressman John Lewis, is to think about all of the many times that he fought, that he probably laid in bed late at night trying to figure out exactly what is going to be the next step. And then having to preach at a very young age what he said. He was preaching to the chickens, and then years and years later talking to millions of people and just listening to all of the things that he has had to accomplish through his lifetime. And then now we're doing this fight again for the rights of people to be able to vote. And so when I look at the work of Congressman John Lewis, I look at someone that our young people can look at, say that, I remember seeing him on TV. They don't have to go back as far as Dr. Martin Luther King or others, but then look at to see exactly what it is that they can do even at a young age of what what can be done for Voting Rights Act, even if they can make some telephone calls, call every day, tell somebody else to call, each one reach one, and we need to make sure that this is, we're just in for the fight, and we're going to make sure that whatever we do, that we know that Congressman John Lewis's hands were on writing this bill, and we want to make sure that his living will not be in vain, and we want to make sure that we can continue his legacy.
Three incredible women sharing their thoughts on John Lewis's legacy. Darlene, I'm going to go to you for this next question. What have been some of the biggest challenges, barriers, and difficulties in the fight for civil rights in our country?
Those who don't remember the past are doomed to repeat it. That has been our biggest fight in the fight for civil rights. And one of those fights includes the right to vote. And when we think about the right to vote, we also have to look at it from a broader perspective of the suffrage movement in general. Because it didn't just start in 1957, which was the very first Civil Rights Act. And it didn't just, the second Civil Rights Act. The first one was right after the Civil War. And it didn't start in 1965 either. It started with the drafting of the Constitution, that only a certain few people could vote. And when you think about it, we were a country in 1776, 1787, when the Constitution was ratified. The first election for George Washington, we were a population of about 2.5 million people. Only 150,000 people had the right to vote. They were predominantly white male, Protestant landowners over the age of 21. So the right to vote has been ongoing since the founding of this country. And you have African Americans that have fought for the right to vote, but also women have fought for the right to vote. And you also have to remember that white women were granted the right to vote with the 19th century, but that did not include, the 19th Amendment, but that did not include African American women. So this has been an ongoing struggle from the founding of this country, and we are trying to get there to make it right so that we can be that more perfect union.
Just touching the tip of the surface on this subject. Darlene, Jeanetta, and Betty, hold that thought. We have to take a quick commercial break, but when we return, we'll resume our in-focus discussion on civil rights and John Lewis's legacy. Thanks for staying with us for our second In Focus discussion tonight on civil rights and John Lewis's legacy. We continue with Darlene McDonald, author and social activist, Jeanetta Williams, president of the NAACP Salt Lake Branch, and Betty Sawyer, president of the Ogden NAACP. Jeanetta, we will start with you for this next question. What is the current state of the current civil rights movement? What are some notable progress that we've made, and what are some of the inequities that we still need to address?
Okay, some of the things that we have looked at through the eyes of and the work of the NAACP is police reform. So we've worked with legislators in the past legislative session and got some bills passed, of course. We're still doing that. Voting rights is going to be, on the forefront rather, of everything that we're doing now as well. And so we will continue with those efforts. It's just heartbreaking to see that so much that we won before the signing of the Voting Rights Act in 1965, and then all of a sudden it was gutted, and then we're starting all over again. Those things, we've had to win our battles in court, and we will continue to do that. So when we look at the timeline of the civil rights movement, I don't think we're really looking at a timeline, but just trying to move forward with all of the different things that are hitting us so fast. So when we're looking at voting rights, and then we're looking at making sure that young people have ability to attend college and graduate, scholarships for those young folks. So there's a lot of things that we're doing, and of course making sure that we're looking at higher wages for folks. And so when we're looking at civil rights, there's a lot of things. There's not just one certain thing that we're looking at. And I think the movement continues, and we must continue to work every day. It's almost 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, working on civil rights and trying to improve living conditions for everybody. And one of the things, of course, when we talk about the Voting Rights Act is making sure that there's no language barriers, that people that speak other languages will be able to vote and understand and even become citizens of our great U.S.
Really, really tireless work. Betty, let's hear from you. What do you think are other notable progresses that we've made, as well as things that we still need to address?
I think across the board there has been somewhat slow and steady progress in those areas that we've been fighting for over 100 years as the NAACP specifically. When we look at housing and housing discrimination, we're getting better, but one of the things we're keeping our eye on with COVID is the displacement of low income and Black and brown people in this housing market, and being able to find decent and affordable housing without being discriminated against. We talked about police reform, but along with that is, with our court system. Right now, we're dealing with people being able to make bail based on the kind of money they have and things of that nature, trying to eliminate some of those barriers, economic barriers, because that shouldn't be a part of our system. The more well off you are, the better you get treated when it comes to our justice system. School reform, education, and equity is always at the forefront. Our young people have had to deal with time out of school, and how do we make sure that we provide the resources necessary as students go back to school to make up for any learning loss. Digital equity, all of those things tie into it. And then how we're teaching and the curriculum that's before our young people as well, as we look at ethnic studies and valuing all people in our country. So those are things that we continue to keep an eye out when it comes to civil rights. And healthcare tied into that is a big issue. Affordable, accessible healthcare for all is something that still deeply concerns us.
It just shows there are so many layers to this work that we are doing within the civil rights movement. Darlene, next question is for you. Throughout the timeline of the civil rights movement, there's been many notable events in its history. Can you talk about the significance of what happened in 2020 following the death of George Floyd?
Yes, I can. Let's look at the timeline of the civil rights movement, actually, because you have one pivotal event that shaped the beginning of what we know today as the civil rights movement. And that was the lynching of a 14-year-old boy in Mississippi by the name of Emmett Till. Now, John Lewis was not that much older than Emmett Till when he was lynched. And he was maybe about 40 miles or so from where Emmett Till was murdered. And he spoke about how that impacted him. And you can draw a straight line from the death of Emmett Till to inspiring Congressman John Lewis. And then the next event that happened was a young woman by the name of Rosa Parks, who sat on a bus and refused to go to the back of the bus. And that began the Montgomery boycott movement. And the minister that they tapped to lead that movement was a 26-year-old minister by the name of Dr. Martin Luther King. So you have these events that sparks the civil rights movement, and then you fast forward to 2020 with the death of a man named George Floyd, a man who did not start his day to be martyred at all, if we want to consider him that. He went to go have his phone fixed. And then we ended up knowing this man's name in Minnesota. But why is that? Because in the summer of 2020, we were also running in the streets for Ahmaud Arbery as well. I was walking, other people was running, but we also had Breonna Taylor. And it was also on the heel of Stephon Clark and Sandra Bland. And sometimes you just get to the point where you say enough is enough. We have marched on the streets, in the streets since John Lewis and Dr. King and Medgar Evers and so many others. And Jimmy Jackson was killed in the Selma through Montgomery March, and that sparked that as well. So we know all these names, and you just get sick and tired of being sick and tired, and it's time for change. And so from that, the George Floyd murder and just watching this man die under the knee of someone, it sparked a multi-generational, multicultural movement that didn't even occur in the 1960s. So it was something that was new to a lot of people, and they got out there and they said, you know, now is the time. Now is the time to make change. We will not do this again. Now is the time.
And we hope so. Darlene, Jeanetta, and Betty, hold that thought. We have to take another quick commercial break, but when we return, we'll resume our In Focus discussion on civil rights and John Lewis's legacy. Welcome to our third and final In Focus discussion tonight on civil rights and John Lewis's legacy. Before the break, we were joined by Darlene McDonald, Jeanetta Williams, and Betty Sawyer. We pick up now right where we left off. This time we will start with you, Jeanetta. Can you share your thoughts regarding what's going on right now in the debate over changes to voting laws, as well as the bill in the U.S. Congress called the John Lewis Voting Rights Act?
Yes, what's going on now is that we've seen state after state putting up voting suppression laws. And of course, we need to make sure that we can get the John Lewis Voting Rights Bill passed. And in doing that, we want to make sure that we can have all of our Congress folks, regardless of if they're in your district or not, we want to make sure that people start calling and making sure that that their voices are heard. Not just making a call one day, but make a call and several calls and ask your friends to make calls every day, because voter suppression is really something that's harming everybody. So it's not just the black and brown, but it's focused more on the black and brown and minority folks. And so we want to make sure that everybody need to make sure that they can look up and they can support pass the For the People Act, and making sure that the legacy of John Lewis lives on, and make sure that we can change those voices. Make sure that you call both Senator Mitt Romney and Senator Mike Lee every day and call and ask them to support this. Making sure that you call all of our Congress folks too, because we don't want them to be hiding behind the scenes saying that they can't support it because they don't know what's in the bill. Well, if it's some things that they don't like in the bill, tell us what they don't like and make those changes. And so we need to hold them accountable. And in order to hold them accountable, we need to make sure that they hear our voices here in the state of Utah. So that is my final word for today. So let's get those calls in, let's ask for that support, and let's pass the For the People Act.
Thank you for that, Jeanetta. We have about a minute left. Darlene, I hope you don't mind if I give the final word to Betty in this segment. Betty, let's end this segment and wrap it up with you tonight. What would you like to leave our viewers with, or what will you be working on or watching for next?
I think the call now is for us to call on, all humanity, our higher angels, to get into good trouble and get this legislation passed. If you don't like the results of an election, you don't get to change all of the rules. You get to work harder to try to be that winning candidate. And what we're seeing, all these rules being changed, is a threat to our democracy. And that's not who we are as a country. That's not who we are as a people. That's not what made us great. So we need to stand on those principles and values that we hold as Americans around the right for everyone, every eligible voter, to be able to vote without hindrance, without impediments, without their vote being suppressed. So let's get the work done and let's work together because it is about all of us.
Thank you so much. You have been hearing from Darlene McDonald, author and social activist, Jeanetta Williams, president of the NAACP Salt Lake Branch, and Betty Sawyer, president of the Ogden NAACP. Thank you all for participating in this panel tonight. Your time and your work in our community are much appreciated.